Priscilla Presley spent 5 decades building one of the most carefully managed legacies in American entertainment. And in 2024, two people she had personally trusted tried to tear it down in court for $50 million. That number alone would be enough to make headlines. But the lawsuit also carried an allegation so dark, so specific, that it reframed every public image of her anyone had ever held. And whether it is true or not, the question it raised about who Priscilla Presley really is has never been more urgent. Born Priscilla Ann Wagner, her childhood moved constantly with her stepfather's Air Force career, from base to base, never long enough in one place to take root. Germany became the hinge point of her entire life. She was 14 years old when she attended a party in Bad Nauheim in 1959 and met Elvis Presley, already 24 and already the most famous entertainer alive. What happened between them over the following years became legend, and for most of the public, it remained the only lens through which she was ever seen. She moved to Graceland while still finishing high school, living under the watch of Elvis's father and grandmother in a house that was both a monument and an enclosure. They married on May 1st, 1967, in a private Las Vegas ceremony that lasted 8 minutes, and 9 months later, Lisa Marie was born. From the outside, the picture looked like a fairy tale. Inside, the marriage was coming apart. Elvis's fame, his infidelities, and a deepening reliance on prescription drugs eroded what they had. Priscilla filed for separation in February 1972, and the divorce finalized in October 1973. She left with her name, her daughter, and the determination that the world would eventually know her as someone it hadn't defined. Acting came first, then business, then the decision that changed everything. In 1982, Priscilla transformed Graceland from a money-draining estate that could have been sold off into a working museum that now draws hundreds of thousands of visitors every year. No one handed her that outcome. She negotiated it, managed it, and built it, deal by deal, until the Presley name became one of the most commercially durable brands in music history. August 16th, 1977, had already reordered her world once. Elvis died at 42, found unresponsive at Graceland, and the global mourning that followed required Priscilla to grieve privately while publicly becoming the estate's guardian. Lisa Marie inherited the estate when she turned 25, pursued a music career of her own, married multiple times, and gave Priscilla 4 grandchildren. The bond between mother and daughter was built on something the rest of the world could only guess at. Both had loved Elvis. Both had outlived him. Both carried his name into decades he never reached. By the early 2020s, Priscilla had pulled back from constant public attention. She appeared occasionally, spoke when something required it, and mostly stayed away from the machinery of celebrity. The estate was running. Graceland was thriving. Everything seemed preserved and settled, the way a well-maintained archive feels, calm on the surface, undisturbed. And then things that had been dormant for years started moving again. Old contracts from different eras began demanding attention. Business arrangements that had existed quietly for decades suddenly had claims attached. People from the past resurfaced with questions. The legal and financial structure surrounding the Presley legacy, always complex, began showing stress. Priscilla recognized the shift the way people who have lived through storms recognize the air pressure changing before anything visible arrives. In October 2024, she announced she was writing a new memoir. The book, titled Softly as I Leave You, Life After Elvis, was scheduled for release in October 2025 and promised to cover 8 decades of living, loving, grieving, and surviving. She had written Elvis and Me in 1985, a bestseller that pulled back the curtain on their marriage. But that biography was written 40 years ago by a younger woman still inside the grief, still assembling her identity. The 2025 memoir came from someone who had accumulated 4 additional decades of experience the first book could not have anticipated. The publisher's descriptions offered a preview of what she would address. She would write about the isolation of Graceland, about being surrounded by Elvis's entourage while feeling profoundly alone. She would explore what it actually cost to leave him, to divorce someone the entire world had claimed as their own. She would write about raising Lisa Marie under the weight of an impossible inheritance, about transforming his Memphis home into a cultural destination, about building a career as an actress and businesswoman in a world that only wanted to ask her about her ex-husband. Most significantly, the memoir would address January 12, 2023, the day Lisa Marie died suddenly at 54 years old. Priscilla had stood at that funeral composed and upright, while everything inside her fractured. The book would give that grief language for the first time, and it would write about what came after, about continuing as a mother, a grandmother, a public figure still being asked to carry a legacy she had spent her whole life tending. The announcement pulled her back into full public view. Magazine profiles, television appearances, and a new generation of fans who had discovered her through the 2022 biographical film about Elvis all converged. Coverage was warm, framing her as someone who had endured extraordinary loss and chosen to speak anyway. And then, almost simultaneously, the lawsuits broke open. Bright Cruz and Kevin Fial had both worked inside Priscilla's professional life. Cruz served as business manager and personal advisor, with access to financial details that most people in her orbit never saw. Fial worked alongside her on ventures connected to the Presley brand. Together, they filed a lawsuit demanding more than $50 million, carrying allegations that went well beyond a standard business dispute. Cruz and Fial claimed Priscilla had committed fraud. She had, according to their filing, deliberately hidden previous business deals from them, sold rights to her name and image without disclosure, and excluded them from agreements they believed they were contractually owed a share of. Their lawsuit described someone who used people's expertise and connections while secretly planning to cut them out, who made promises she never intended to honor, who routed profits elsewhere while they continued working on her behalf. Priscilla's legal response reframed the entire situation. Her team accused Cruz and Fial of elder abuse, arguing that the two had systematically isolated her from other advisors, pushed her toward deals that served their financial interests, and exploited her trust during the period when she was most vulnerable, the months following Lisa Marie's death. Her lawyers described unauthorized financial decisions, mismanagement of funds, and a calculated effort to make themselves indispensable so that no one else could challenge their access to her affairs. The financial figures compounded the story further. Cruz and Fial also alleged that Priscilla had hidden a collection of jewelry and Elvis memorabilia worth over $25 million from the Internal Revenue Service. These were not generic assets. The collection reportedly included pieces Elvis had personally worn, gifts he had given her, artifacts tied directly to one of the most documented careers in rock and roll history. If accurate, this was not a bookkeeping oversight. This was potential tax fraud, at a scale that carries criminal exposure, not simply civil liability. And the distinction matters enormously for a woman of her age and public profile. And then Cruz and Fial included a claim that stopped people entirely. They alleged that Priscilla's decision to remove life support from Lisa Marie on January 12, 2023, had been driven not by medical necessity or compassion, but by a desire to gain control of the estate and its trust. The allegation was specific enough to be taken seriously, and monstrous enough that many refused to entertain it. It took the image of a mother standing broken at her daughter's funeral and suggested that beneath the grief was calculation, that she had seen Lisa Marie's death not as the worst thing that had ever happened to her, but as a financial opening. Public reaction split hard. Supporters called the claim fabricated cruelty, a litigation weapon aimed at destroying a 79-year-old woman because a business arrangement had gone sideways. Others pointed to the specificity of the court filing and noted that accusations this severe are rarely included without something behind them. The truth remained sealed inside legal documents, inaccessible to anyone on the outside. But the allegation itself spread across every entertainment news platform within hours of becoming public record. The Presley estate is not merely a collection of property and royalties. It encompasses one of the most recognized names in music history, a brand extended across Graceland tourism, merchandise licensing, documentary deals, streaming platforms, and tribute events that fill venues across multiple countries. Priscilla had been the architect of that commercial structure since 1982, and her authority over it had never faced a serious public challenge until now. These lawsuits changed the nature of her standing entirely. If the cases proceed to trial, every decision she made over the past 4 decades becomes subject to examination under oath. Financial statements, contracts, emails, and depositions could enter public record, exposing the inner workings of an estate that has operated privately for decades. The question of who manages the trust for Lisa Marie's 4 children, who approves Elvis's image for new commercial uses, who controls how he is remembered, all of it suddenly becomes contested rather than settled. Settlement is the more probable outcome. Most lawsuits at this scale resolve before trial, with terms sealed and questions permanently unanswered. Priscilla might choose to pay rather than risk the exposure of full proceedings, even if she regards every claim against her as false. That path ends the legal chapter, but leaves a permanent shadow across her name. The memoir carries unusual weight in this context. A book written with genuine honesty, one that addresses the accusations directly and gives readers the full measure of a life lived under extraordinary public pressure, could shift the narrative. Readers who understand her story completely might see not a woman of concealment, but someone who navigated impossible circumstances from the age of 14 and made mistakes along the way, as everyone does who lives that long and that publicly. They might see the grief, the decades of work, the years spent holding a legacy together largely alone, and extend the grace that complicated lives require. A memoir that avoids the hardest questions will have the opposite effect. Journalists are already positioned to fact-check every sentence against court documents and prior statements. Any gap between what she writes and what the evidence shows will be read as confirmation of the worst interpretations. Priscilla Presley has never had the option of private life. From the teenage girl photographed arriving at Graceland to the widow who stood composed at Elvis's funeral, to the businesswoman who rescued a cultural landmark, to the grandmother who buried her only child. Each chapter played out in front of cameras, analyzed by strangers, reduced to headlines by people who never spoke to her. Even now, nearing 80, she sits in depositions instead of spending quiet afternoons with grandchildren, reading claims about herself in news articles instead of resting in the peace she spent 5 decades working toward. What history decides about her will depend on how the remaining pieces resolve. The lawsuits are unfinished. The memoir is out. The grief that began on January 12, 2023 does not end. And Graceland still stands in Memphis, still drawing its faithful every day, still playing Elvis's music through the rooms where all of this began, indifferent to the legal battles being fought in his name and in hers.